Somewhere along the banks of the Yellow River in central China, 5,000 years ago, a child pressed their fingers into wet clay. They were not playing. They were not making a mess. They were working, crafting a vessel with the kind of precise, practiced skill that takes years to develop. And that child had no idea that the invisible swirling ridges on the tips of their fingers would survive the rise and fall of entire civilizations, 2 ice ages of cultural memory, and eventually land in the hands of a team of modern scientists who would look at those tiny ancient fingerprints and completely rewrite everything we thought we knew about childhood in the ancient world. This is not a story about archaeology finding something old. This is a story about the oldest workforce on Earth, and what it tells us about children, about knowledge, about the way human civilizations actually build themselves from the ground up, is something that should shake you to your core. Let's set the scene. We are talking about the Yangshao culture, one of the most extraordinary Neolithic civilizations that has ever been uncovered by modern archaeology, and one of the most important chapters in the entire story of human development. The Yangshao people flourished along the middle reaches of the Yellow River for roughly 2,000 years, from around 5,000 BCE to 3,000 BCE. A span of time so vast, it makes every European medieval dynasty look like a weekend. They lived across what is now the provinces of Henan, Shaanxi, and Shaanxi, in central northern China, building villages of semi-subterranean roundhouses organized around central plazas, surrounded by ring ditches that served as both drainage systems and defensive perimeters. They grew millet in fields that terraced down to the river valleys. They kept pigs and dogs. They hunted and fished and wove textiles fine enough to leave impressions in clay that researchers can still read today. They appear to have practiced some form of sericulture, the tending of silkworms, that would eventually blossom into one of the most consequential technologies in Chinese history. And they made pottery. Extraordinary, stunning, technically demanding, painted pottery that modern ceramic artists look at with genuine professional respect. This was not primitive craft. This was art and science fused into a single object, repeated at scale across hundreds of villages over the course of 2,000 years. The Yangshao culture was first identified in 1921 when a Swedish geologist and archaeologist named Johan Gunnar Andersson excavated a site in Mianchi County, Henan Province, in what is now recognized as one of the pivotal moments in the history of Chinese archaeology. Since then, hundreds of Yangshao sites have been discovered across northern China, from Gansu Province in the far northwest to the eastern plains of Henan, making the Yangshao one of the most geographically expansive prehistoric cultures ever documented anywhere in the world. Their pottery, which gives the culture its alternate name, the painted pottery culture, was produced in a remarkable range of forms, colors, and decorative styles that evolved and shifted over those 2,000 years. The earliest wares were red and brown earthenware fired at temperatures between 500 and 600 degrees Celsius. As the culture matured and spread, the pottery became progressively more sophisticated, finer clay, higher firing temperatures, more intricate painted designs in black and red pigments, geometric spirals, fish motifs, human faces, and abstract animal forms that some scholars believe carried shamanistic or cosmological significance. The pointed bottom bottles, called jiandiping, narrow-mouthed, elegantly tapered, designed to be thrust into soft earth or riverbeds, are among the most visually striking ceramic forms produced by any Neolithic culture anywhere on Earth. They required genuine technical mastery to produce. The walls had to be thin but strong. The balance had to be precise. The clay had to be worked with confident, sure hands. And this is where the fingerprints come in. At the Beiyangping site in Lingbao, Henan Province, a Yangshao settlement that spans the middle to late phases of the culture, a team of Chinese researchers began systematically examining the surfaces of pottery sherds recovered from the site with a level of forensic precision that would not have been out of place in a modern crime laboratory. What they were looking for was something that had been hiding in plain sight on ancient ceramics for decades, something that most adolescents' ridges are somewhat wider, and adults' ridges are wider still. By measuring the mean ridge breadth of a fingerprint, even when pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, researchers can calculate with statistical confidence what age category the person who made it belonged to: child, adolescent, or adult. And by combining this ridge breadth measurement with a second variable, ridge density, which is the number of ridges packed into a given area of the fingerprint and which differs reliably between biological males and females, researchers can go even further and make statistically grounded inferences about the sex of the ancient potter. This field of study is called paleodermatoglyphics, and it is one of the most quietly extraordinary tools in modern archaeology. The researchers at Beiyangping applied these forensic techniques to a sample of fingerprint impressions collected from pottery sherds, recovered across multiple phases of the site's occupation. They measured the mean ridge breadth of each recoverable print using Precise microscopic analysis. They calculated the coefficient of variation, a statistical measure of consistency within their measurements, to ensure their data was reliable. And then they ran their findings through a Bayesian mixture model, a sophisticated statistical framework that allows researchers to infer the distribution of a population's characteristics from incomplete sample data. What they found should have been impossible, according to every assumption the archaeological community had previously made about who was doing the actual work of pottery production in Neolithic China. The fingerprints did not come predominantly from adult male potters, as everyone had assumed. They did not come predominantly from adult women, as some alternative theories had suggested. They came from a striking cross-section of the community. The gender ratio across the full sample worked out to approximately 44% male and 56% female, a near parity that itself challenges simplistic assumptions about gendered labor in the ancient world. But the truly shocking finding was in the age distribution. Among the male, potters whose fingerprints were identifiable, approximately 36%, more than a third, were under 15 years old. Under 15. These were children who were not watching adults make pottery from a safe distance, not playing with leftover clay, scraps at the edge of the workshop. Children whose fingerprints appear on the interior and exterior surfaces of functional fired pottery vessels, the same vessels that were used in daily life, in storage, in cooking, and ritual, with a frequency and a distribution that tells researchers these children were not observers. They were workers. They were craftspeople. And they were skilled. To understand how shocking this is, you need to understand what it actually takes to make good pottery by hand. There is a reason the phrase "incapable hands" exists as an idiom. Hand-building pottery, whether through pinching, coiling, slab construction, or the kind of complex hybrid techniques that Yangshao potters used, requires a degree of kinesthetic intelligence that takes years to develop. You have to feel the clay. You have to understand its moisture content, its consistency, its behavior at different stages of drying. You have to know exactly how much pressure to apply with each finger and how to distribute the force of your hands evenly so the walls of the vessel remain consistent in thickness. Apply too much pressure in one spot and the wall cracks or collapses. Apply too little and the vessel becomes uneven and structurally weak. The pointed bottom John dipping bottles that are among the most iconic forms associated with the Yangshao culture are particularly demanding. Their shapes requires a mastery of the coiling technique and a precise understanding of how to build upward while maintaining the symmetry of a form that has no flat base to rest on while it is being constructed. These are not tasks that a small child stumbles into accidentally. These are skills that require training, practice, repetition, and mentorship. And the fingerprints at Beiyangping tell us that children under 15 were not just exposed to this training, they were demonstrably producing finished objects. This completely overturns the assumption, comforting to modern sensibilities, but apparently incorrect, that children in ancient agricultural societies were essentially protected from skilled craft production until they reached some threshold of physical or cognitive maturity. What the Beiyangping evidence suggests instead is that childhood in the Yangshao world was a period of intense, structured, skill-based apprenticeship. From a very young age, children were integrated into the production processes of the community, not as bystanders or helpers in the most marginal sense, but as genuine participants in the knowledge transmission system that kept the community functioning. The pottery a Yangshao village produced was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. Every vessel that held stored grain through a winter, every cooking pot that processed the millet and the river fish that fed a family, every ritual container that played a role in the burial customs or the shamanic ceremonies that organized the community's spiritual life, all of these things had to be made, and made well, by someone with real skill. The idea that children were contributing meaningfully to this production from an early age tells us that the Yangshao people understood something that modern industrial societies have largely forgotten. That skill is not a gift you receive when you come of age. It is something that grows inside you, slowly, over years, if you are placed in the right conditions and given the right mentorship from the very beginning of your conscious life. The implications of this extend far beyond the Yellow River Valley, because the Beiyangping site is not the only place where forensic fingerprint analysis has revealed unexpected things about who was actually making ancient pottery. At Tel Safi in Israel, the site of the ancient Philistine city of Gath, home of the biblical Goliath, researchers applied the same combination of mean ridge breadth and ridge density analysis to 112 fingerprints found on early Bronze Age pottery, dating to roughly 2850 to 2500 BCE. What they found was a complex picture of cooperative labor. Most pottery was made by adult and young males, sometimes working together, sometimes in cooperation with females. Children's prints were found, but interestingly, they appeared only on the handles of vessels. suggesting that in the Bronze Age urban environment of Telesafi, children were participating in specific stages of the production process rather than making complete vessels independently. This contrast with the Beiyangping data is itself revealing. At Beiyangping, children's fingerprints appear on both the interior and exterior surfaces of complete vessels, not just on secondary components like handles. This suggests a higher degree of child involvement in the full production process in the Neolithic Yangshao context than in the Bronze Age urban Levantine context. As societies became more complex, more stratified, and more formally organized around specialized workshops and professional craft production, children may have been progressively pushed to the margins of the process. In the more communal, village-based social structure of the Yangshao, they were apparently central to it. In North America, researchers studying fingerprints on ancestral pueblo and pottery, the remarkable ceramic tradition of the ancient peoples of the American Southwest, found that the evidence pointed to pottery production being predominantly female, with women of various ages making up the core of the production workforce. This finding aligned with ethnographic accounts from later pueblo communities, where pottery making was a female-dominated tradition passed from mother to daughter across generations. The method used in these studies, measuring ridge breadth as an indicator of age and ridge density as an indicator of sex, was the same forensic toolkit deployed at Beiyangping, demonstrating that paleodermatoglyphics is a cross-cultural method that can be reliably applied to ceramics from radically different times and places. And yet each application reveals something different about the specific society that made the objects, because the fingerprints are not just biological data. They are social data. They encode in their microscopic ridges the labor organization, the gender dynamics, the age structure, and the knowledge transmission systems of the communities that left them behind. There is also a deeper, more philosophically unsettling dimension to this story that has to do with what a fingerprint actually is. We live in an age where fingerprints are primarily understood through the lens of forensic identification, crime scenes, passport control, smartphone security. The assumption behind all of these applications is the assumption that has driven fingerprint science since Francis Galton formally established the uniqueness of fingerprints in his 1892 work, that no two fingerprints from different fingers are identical, and that fingerprint ridge patterns are unchanging throughout life. Your fingerprints form in the womb in the 14th to 24th week of gestation through a process of differential growth and buckling of the skin layers of your fingertips that is influenced by a complex interaction of genetics and the specific physical environment of your fetal development, the position of your fingers in the womb, the pressure and movement dynamics of the amniotic fluid, the precise texture of the surfaces your hands brush against as they develop. The result is a pattern that is uniquely yours, not because of a single gene that codes for it, but because of the extraordinary specificity of the conditions under which you grew. Even identical twins, who share the same DNA, have different fingerprints because the physical microenvironment in which their fingers developed was not identical. What this means, in the context of the Beiyangping pottery, is genuinely staggering. When a researcher in a modern Chinese laboratory looks through a microscope at a ridge breadth measurement on a pottery sherd recovered from a site that was occupied 5,000 years ago, they are measuring the actual physical impression left by an actual individual human child who was alive and working in the Yellow River Valley in approximately 3000 BCE. Not a symbol of that child, not an artistic representation, not a description in a text. The literal physical trace of an individual human being's body. There's a child whose name we will never know, whose face we will never see, whose thoughts and experiences and relationships with the other people in their village are almost entirely lost to us. And yet we have their fingerprint. We can tell from its ridge breadth that they were young. We can tell from the location of the print on the vessel that they were involved in shaping it. We can infer from the skill evident in the vessel's construction that they knew what they were doing. Out of everything that archaeologists work with, bones, tools, settlements, symbols, there is perhaps nothing more intimate, nothing more direct, nothing more personal than a fingerprint. And these fingerprints are 5,000 years old. The science being used to decode these ancient impressions has advanced enormously in the last decade. Modern researchers no longer rely solely on simple ridge breadth measurements taken with a handheld gauge. They use high-resolution digital microscopy that can capture the three-dimensional topography of a fingerprint impression in the surface of a pottery sherd at sub-millimeter resolution. They use photographic enhancement techniques that can reveal ridge details invisible to the naked eye. They use computational statistical models, including Bayesian frameworks that can make probabilistic inferences about population-level demographics from a relatively small sample of individual prints, to turn the data from these microscopic measurements into meaningful archaeological conclusions. And increasingly, researchers are exploring how the same artificial intelligence and machine learning tools that are transforming modern forensic fingerprint analysis might be applied to ancient ceramics. AI systems trained on large databases of modern fingerprints, with their associated age and sex data, could potentially be retrained and adapted to make finer-grained inferences from ancient prints than current manual measurement techniques allow, accounting for the taphonomic distortion caused by firing, burial, and the passage of time in ways that even the most skilled human analyst might miss. This convergence of ancient material and cutting-edge computational technology is one of the defining frontiers of modern archaeology, and the Yangshao pottery fingerprints are one of its most compelling test cases. It is also worth pausing to consider what this discovery tells us about the Yangshao society itself in a broader sense, because the picture that emerges from the Beiyangping fingerprint data is one that is strikingly at odds with the condescending narratives that have sometimes been applied to Neolithic peoples. The Yangshao were not a primitive people stumbling toward civilization in darkness. They were a sophisticated, well-organized society that had developed remarkably effective systems for transmitting complex technical knowledge across generations. The near gender parity in the pottery production data suggests a society in which craft production was not rigidly assigned along gender lines, but was accessible to community members based on skill, aptitude, and perhaps family tradition. The significant presence of children, not just adolescents approaching adulthood, but children under 15, in the production of real functional pottery suggests a community that took the education and integration of its youngest members seriously enough to give them real responsibilities and real skills from an early age. And the sophistication of the Yangshao pottery itself, the delicate painted designs, the technically demanding forms, the range of vessel types adapted to specific functional needs, tells us that whatever system of craft transmission these people used, it worked, generation after generation, across 2,000 years and hundreds of villages spread across an area the size of modern Europe. The knowledge of how to find the right clay, prepare it correctly, build a vessel by hand, decorate it with painted designs of real artistic complexity, and fire it successfully in a kiln that had to reach temperatures hundreds of degrees higher than a campfire. All of this knowledge was preserved and transmitted without writing, without schools, without any of the formal institutional apparatus that modern societies consider necessary for education. It was transmitted through hands, through the physical act of working alongside someone who already knew, pressing clay together, feeling the difference between what works and what doesn't, leaving fingerprints in the surface of a vessel that 5,000 years later would tell a researcher in a modern laboratory that a child had been here, working, learning, contributing. The ancient DNA research that has emerged from Yangshao-related sites in recent years adds another layer of context to this picture that is worth understanding. A 2025 study, published in BMC Biology, analyzed genome-wide data from individuals buried at the Zhanmatun site, which belong to the Qinhuangzhai cultural variant of the broader Yangshao tradition. The results showed that these individuals were genetically homogeneous with other Yangshao-related populations across a wide geographic area, suggesting that the remarkable cultural uniformity of Yangshao pottery traditions, which had puzzled archaeologists for a century, was not just a matter of traded goods or shared aesthetic preferences, but was rooted in deep genetic continuity across a population that was, at the population level, genuinely interconnected across vast distances. Other ancient DNA research from related Yellow River Neolithic contexts has found mitochondrial haplogroups, the markers passed from mother to child through the maternal line, that persist in varying frequencies in modern East Asian populations today, creating a continuous genetic thread that connects the children pressing their fingers into clay at Beiyangping to hundreds of millions of living people whose ancestors were part of that same tradition. The children whose fingerprints survive on those pottery sherds are not strangers to the modern world. They are, in a very real biological sense, among the ancestors of a significant portion of humanity. There is one more finding connected to this broader story that deserves attention, and it comes not from China, but from the opposite end of the ancient world. In 2026, a paper published in the journal Science Advances reported on the discovery of the earliest known clay ornaments in Southwest Asia, objects recovered from sites in what is now Israel and dated to 15,000 years ago, a full 10,000 years before the Yangshao were making their painted pottery. Among those objects, some appeared to have been specifically designed for children, including a tiny ring so small that it could only have been made for a child's finger. And the fingerprints of the makers, preserved in the clay of these ornaments, included prints that appeared to belong to children themselves. The researchers concluded that children were not just wearing these clay objects, they were making them 15,000 years ago. In a society still largely dependent on hunting and gathering before agriculture, before pottery in the conventional sense, children were working with clay, deliberately, skillfully, expressively, leaving the marks of their small hands and materials that would survive until our own time to tell the story. What this suggests is that the involvement of children in clay working and craft production is not a specific feature of the Yangshao culture, or of ancient China, or of any particular civilization. It may be a human universal, a pattern so deeply embedded in the way our species organizes, the transmission of knowledge that it appeared independently across cultures separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. What we are dealing with here is not a surprising archaeological footnote. We are dealing with a fundamental revision of how we understand childhood in the ancient world, and by extension, how we understand the process by which human civilizations actually build and sustain themselves over time. The assumption that childhood is essentially a protected period of passive development, during which the adult world of skilled work is kept at a safe remove until some threshold of maturity is crossed, is an assumption that belongs to a very specific slice of modern industrialized society. The evidence from Beiyangping, from Telesafi, from the ancestral Puebloan sites of the American Southwest, and now from 15,000-year-old clay ornaments in Israel, tells a completely different story. It tells the story of children who were active participants in the knowledge economy of their communities from the very earliest ages at which their hands could manage the work. Children who learned by doing. Children who produced real things that real communities depended upon. Children whose fingerprints, frozen in clay for 5,000 years, speak to us across the entirety of recorded history and remind us that the capacity for skill, for craft, for the kind of deliberate, intelligent work that we like to think of as distinctively adult, has always lived in small hands too. The ancient pottery of the Yangshao culture sits in museums and research institutions across China. Most visitors who look at it see elegant geometric designs in black and red on cream-colored clay. They see pointed-bottom bottles and round-bodied jars in sophisticated forms that somehow